Okay. So we're going through the tissues, and we're talking about nervous tissue. So nervous tissue, basically, this is your conductive tissue. And you guys would probably like me to share the screen. That would probably be a good thing. So in nervous tissue, there's two major pieces to nervous tissue. There's neurons, which is usually what we think of as nervous tissue, and then there's neuroglia. And the purpose of this being conductive tissue is your integration system, the nervous system is. So you're looking at sensory inputs, integration of those sensory inputs and the outputs of the motor response. So what is your response? You have to be able to sense your environment, make sense of your environment, and then make some sort of a response associated with that, right? So very similar, like I say, always use the boxer analogy, right? Very similar to a boxer, right? A boxer is constantly taking in information, input. Is this guy throwing me a left hook? Is he throwing me a right hook? Is he throwing me a jab, right? So that incoming sensory information has got to be processed by the brain in terms of what's coming at you, and then the response has to be appropriate to that, right? So for instance, if the left hook is coming, you don't lean left, you don't lean into the punch, otherwise you're going to be taking a nap, right? So you basically dodge the punch, and so that is the appropriate response. And so the same thing is true at a physiological level. We take a look at neurons. Neurons have a couple of major components to them. First of all, they have what's called the cell body, and so the cell body is just like any other cell. So this is basically the main portion that we usually think of as the cell proper. So this is your cell body. And then coming into the cell body are inputs, fibers basically that are dendrites bringing messages into the cell body. And then leading away from the cell body is the axon. So the axon is that main process of the neuron that's basically leading the way. So you're either carrying information toward the cell body or away from the cell body, whether or not you're the dendrites bringing information to the cell body for the cell body to be able to process, and then sending out your response out on the axon. A lot of axons in neurons are covered in myelin, which is kind of a fatty substance. It's actually a lipid membrane. And it's actually the membrane of a glial cell, or we just talked about neuroglia. So these neuroglia are basically support cells that are supporting the functions of the neuron. And the myelin basically acts a lot like insulation on a wire. So it allows you to basically be able to have focused transmission of your electrical signal so that it's basically moving forward. If you didn't have that, you'd have all this random scatter of electricity kind of buzzing all around the wire, and you wouldn't really be able to get good focused movement, directional movement forward. And then typically when we take a look at nerves themselves, nerves are essentially bundles of axons that are usually moving in the same direction. So this is kind of what it looks like. So here's your neuron itself. So you can see you've got your cell body, which is the most largest part of the actual cell itself. The dendrites are basically leading in, bringing in all kinds of messages from other places for you to process in the cell body. And then you have your myelin-covered axon that's transmitting the response or the output. And you can see how this particular cell here, this particular glial cell, is essentially creating a little extension of its membrane and wrapping that membrane multiple times around that myelin sheath. So it's kind of like just giving it a good wrap around that, and that's giving it good focus. And this is actually in a micrograph of what the neurons look like. So they actually do look very much the way we draw them. Now, neuroglia, this is the other part of the neural tissue. There are more neuroglia than there are neurons. Now, neurons are sort of like the marquee cells, right? But most of your nervous tissue is made up of the neuroglia cell or the support cells. Now, when you take a look at these guys, there's about almost 10 times more neuroglia than there are neurons. and they take up a good chunk. Now, typically what they're doing is these guys are a support entourage, if you will. They nourish the neurons, they support the neurons, they do pretty much whatever the neurons need to do. It's kind of like a celebrity relationship. For any of you who like to sort of celebrity watch, you like to follow your favorite celebrities. Any of you Swifties out there, right? You Swift fans. Any major celebrity like her has an entourage, right? It's not just you going out somewhere. It's like you and your crew being like your bodyguards, your organizers, your assistants, right? I mean, so you've got this entire group of people that basically do all these different tasks for you and kind of keep your schedule and do all these different jobs and tasks. That's kind of what the neuroglia is. Neuroglia are basically a cell group that essentially lives to support and promote the function of the neurons themselves. Okay, so that's neural tissue. Now let's take a look at epithelial tissue. So epithelial tissue, when we take a look at it, is basically a type of tissue that's defined by the cells that are in the tissue itself. So they tend to be fairly tightly packed together, and they oftentimes will form liners, either external liners or liners of your body cavities. And so they'll cover your surfaces or skin, for instance. The other big function is glandular, which basically means they secrete hormones in this particular case. Okay. Now, typical structure of this particular type of tissue is that they have a particular type of aspect to them. So they are anchored. Now, what they are is, when you take a look at a lining, I'm just going to use a particular type of tissue. I'm going to use simple squamous, which are flat, one layer of flat cells. And generally speaking, when you have this like little layer of cells, they're connected together by these cell junctions, these cell connections that you see connecting these guys all together. Now, you can't just have a bunch of cells connect together. You have to have them glued to something. They have to be actually founded on something, like some sort of a support frame. And that support frame typically is this kind of connective tissue-y underlayer that basically is right underneath it. That's what's called the basement membrane. So this basement membrane is sort of like the tack paper, if you will, that you glue your epithelial liner cells onto. So what that means is when you blow this image up on any given cell, so here's my picture of my cell, you're going to have a basal layer. So here's your basement membrane. So you're going to have what's called a basal layer. And then on the top, which is attached to the free space, is going to be what's called your apical layer, or your apical surface, not layer. Layer is actually, I want to use a different word there. It's not quite accurate. The basal surface and the apical surface. So there's two of them. And so that's the free space side. And the reason why I wanted to change that is because your organization of your apical versus basal surface is what's going to define you as a tissue in terms of how many layers you have. Now, you can classify epithelial tissue by its layers, number one, and also by its shape. So by layering, we can determine that an epithelial tissue is either stratified or simple. If you're simple, what that means is you're a single layer of cells. That is to say that the same layer is in contact with both apical and basal surfaces. If you're stratified, that means you're multiple layers. That means different layers or different cells are in contact with apical and basal layers. So let's take a look at this. So here's an example of simple. This happens to be one layer. So here you can see, here's your apical surface up here. Here's your basal surface. It's the same cell. It's the same layer. So this would be simple. Stratified, on the other hand, would be a little bit different, right? So basically, here's your basal layer down here. This is your apical surface up here. Notice this row of cells is the basal layer. Then you've got this layer, and you got a whole bunch of little layers in here until you get to the apical. So the layer of cells that's touching the apical is different than the layer of cells that's touching the basal. And that's how you define stratified, multiple layers. And then we have another one that's called pseudo-stratified. So pseudo basically means fake. And the reason is because when you take a look at it, when you take a look at stratified, what you'll notice in stratified epithelium is the nuclei tend to kind of form these like little rows sometimes, and you'll be able to see these little rows like this. And it kind of forms these like layers, if you will. Now, in pseudostratified, oftentimes what will happen is you'll see what looks like these little rows of cells, like almost two rows. It almost looks stratified at first glance, right? Because you see those two rows of nuclei, but it's not. It's actually simple. Why? Because when you take a look at it, you notice the same cell is both apical and basal. So this is a simple cell. So is this one, apical and basal. This is a simple cell. So is this one, so is this one, so is this one, so is this one, so is this one. It just happens to be that these cells here are kind of tucked in behind, making it look as if they are a basal layer that's not also apical. Does that make sense? So this is what's called pseudo-stratified. They're actually simple in construction. Now, you can also categorize epithelial cell by their shape. For instance, squamous is flat. So these are flattened cells. So simple squamous would be a single layer of flattened cells. Oftentimes we'll find these around our lungs. They'll oftentimes be associated with important physiological membranes where we have to get short distances, like diffusion across short distances, like in your lungs, for instance, exchange of gas, oxygen and CO2 is going to be happening across these very short membranes. These are going to be simple squamous. You also have simple cuboid. In this case, your shape is going to be cuboidal shape. Squamous is flat in shape, or you're going to have columnar cells, which looks more rectangular. So a simple cuboid is essentially a single layer of cuboid-shaped cells. And so here's a couple of real images of them. This is what your simple squamous looks like. So notice, if you're looking at them from on the top, they look like basically a bunch of sort of flat, sort of pancake-ish looking cells with a large nucleus in the middle. If you looked at them from the side, this would be the side view, they'd look flat, edge on. Now, simple cuboidal, like for instance in the kidneys and the kidney tubules, you'll see basically they're these kind of, they're not perfectly cuboid, they're just sort of cuboid-ish, but you can see they're kind of block-like in structure and in shape, and they're basically going to form a single layer. Your basement membrane, by the way, is this guy right around here. That's your basement membrane when you have like a little circular structure like that. And then the inside opening area is what's called the lumen, or the open area on the inside of that tubular system. So that's an example of your simple cuboid. Then you also have simple columnar. So basically a single layer of column-shaped rectangular-like cells. And then, of course, our pseudostratified ciliated columnar, which we saw before. This one's important because oftentimes on the surface of it, on the apical surface, you'll have cilia that will allow you to move mucus across the surface, or sweeps mucus across the surface. Matter of fact, this is what your respiratory tract is covered in. Your trachea are covered in pseudostratified ciliated columnar. And so what they do is they actually secrete mucus. So if you take a look at these cells actually are secreting these big globs of mucus. So this basically right here is a big glob of mucus. And so when it secretes that mucus, it basically creates this gooey sort of fluidy portion of the mucus that's kind of underpinned by the cilia, which are these little hair-like structures. And what happens is the cilia beat back and forth, and they're waving back and forth. And what happens is when you breathe in dirty air, it traps dirt particles in the mucus, and then the cilia sweep those dirt particles up into your cough reflex, and you cough it out. Okay, so this is the reason why you kind of cough more when you start to have a bunch of dirty air or smoke or things like that that you're breathing in. So that's an example of pseudostratified ciliated columnar. And simple columnar is just a single line of these large rectangular cells. So this is like your intestinal epithelium. You can see these large rectangular shaped cells. You can see typically a nice little line of nuclei right at the bottom, almost like a little picket fence. And you can see these guys are also secreting mucus that's out there lining your intestinal tract. Those cells that secrete mucus are what's called goblet cells. Why? Because they look like goblets. So when you take a look at the mucus, it looks something like this, like a goblet. And so this would be the mucus inside that's basically being secreted to the outside of the cell. So those are some of the coverings. Notice different types of coverings, yes? So doing different functions. Your simple squamous or your stratified squamous are basically lining things, covering things up. Your columnar epithelium, especially in your intestines, are busy doing things like absorbing your nutrients that you've eaten. The other function of epithelial tissue is glandular, right? So in this case, you're going to be secreting some sort of a product. So your glands are made up of epithelial cells. And you have two different types of secretion patterns that you see when you're looking at secretion. One is what's called exocrine. Exocrine basically means you're secreting your products into a duct system, similar to your pancreas secreting your digestive enzymes into the pancreatic duct, which then empties into your duodenum, which is the first portion of your small intestines. Your endocrine glands are going to be secreting directly into the bloodstream. For instance, another function of your pancreas, which is to make insulin, which is a protein hormone that regulates blood glucose. This one is going to be secreted directly into the bloodstream and distributed throughout your body to regulate your blood glucose levels. So your pancreas is really a good illustration or a good example of both exocrine and endocrine activities. And so you have both strategies. So typically when you look at stratified epithelium, you have several layers. And usually this is a tough covering. So if you have a lot of stratified squamous epithelium, usually you're covering something with lots of mechanical stress to it. Like your skin is a good example. You're tough on your skin. You're constantly rubbing it on stuff, right? It's kind of under physical strain all the time, right? You're constantly beating up on it, grabbing it. It's getting poked and prodded and pulled and yanked. And same thing with your mouth. You're constantly chewing, right? The food is constantly physically bombarding the inside of your mouth. Not only that, but if you happen to bite your cheek, you're also inducing more physical strain on that as well. Your esophagus, that food bolus, that pasty food bolus that you chewed up and you swallowed, that's basically going down your esophagus, and that's frictional, right? So there's basically this kind of frictional drag associated with that going down your esophagus, and so you have multiple layers of these squamous cells to help protect you from this kind of frictional strain that you're under. And that's pretty common when you see stratified squamous. Transitional epithelium is basically only found in one place, and that's the urinary bladder. And this is a different one because it changes shape. So when it's relaxed, it's kind of this cuboid looking structure. But when it's stretched out, it looks flat and squamous. It's kind of like elastic almost in nature. And this is just basically so that you can kind of bend and sort of flexibly stretch out and adapt to your filling bladder. So here's your stratified squamous. You'll notice that on the basal portion of your layers, you have your basal layer, the bottom layer. And in the upper portion, you have the multiple layers of tissue. And so this is going to be like what typical skin looks like. So you have these kind of dead, tough exterior layers that kind of protects you from friction and frictional force. Okay, so let's take a look at and move quickly through organ systems, because we're going to be going through the organ systems more specifically, right? So just to kind of rehash on chapter 1, we already covered a little bit of this in chapter 1, so I don't want to spend a ton of time here. But basically, just to refresh your memory, organs are essentially groups of tissues that are performing a common function. And when you have multiple organs pulled together to do one particular thing, it's an organ system. A good example is liver is an organ that's made of multiple tissues and is part of the digestive system. And so these will then be designed to ingest and digest and eliminate food and waste. And typically organs are living inside the cavities that are inside your body, which are lined with membranes, serous membranes, that will essentially both cover the organs and also cover the inside of your cavities. So when you take a look at some terminology, just as basic functional terminology, positional terminology, and anatomy and physiology, especially for identifying organs and things of that nature, you have a couple of major different types of positional terms. For instance, ventral or anterior refers to the front. So your chest is your ventral or anterior portion. Dorsal is posterior, that's your back. Think of a shark's dorsal fin, that's on a shark's back, right? Superior means above, inferior means below. So things are like my head is superior to my neck, hopefully. A couple of other things. Notice these things come in pairs. So they usually come as a duo. Another thing is medial lateral, right? So as something that is medial is referred to as being close to the midline of the body, whereas lateral is further away from the midline of the body. For instance, my pinky toe is lateral to my big toe, which is medial because it's closer into the midline of my body. Okay. Another one that sometimes confuses students is the proximal distal dyad. So basically proximal distal is usually associated with a reference point. So you're referring to some sort of a reference point, and proximal simply means that it's closer, typically the trunk of the body, which is our main reference point. Distal means it's further away from the trunk of the body. So my wrist, for instance, is distal to my elbow. My elbow is more proximal. That means it's in closer to the trunk of my body, whereas my wrist is a little further out there, if you will, as an extremity. And so sometimes you'll run into those terms, proximal and distal, relative to different types of organs. Now let's take a look at our organ systems. We're just going to do a quick rundown, right? So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these because this is basically kind of like a little bit of a visual table of contents, but we have the integument system, which is skin, cardiovascular, lymphatic, and immune, our digestive, respiratory, and urinary. And then, of course, we have our skeletal, musculoskeletal, so muscular system, skeletal system, nervous system, endocrine, and reproductive. And those are our main systems that we have. And they have each their own function to perform in the body itself. Not going to spend a whole lot of time in saying, like, you know, which organ system does this, right? So that's going to be something that I would rather save until we get to that system, and then we'll do the deep dive on what the functions of those systems are as we get to those systems individually. But we did mention body cavity, so let's take a look at what kind of body cavities we have. We have two dominant types of body cavities. We have a ventral and a dorsal. That is to say, we have a chestward or a backward type of a cavity. The one we typically spend the most time studying is the ventral cavity, where we have what's called a coelom, which basically is a cavity in early development. So it's basically just a big hollowing area. And within this cavity, what we have is a couple of subcavities. So we have the thoracic cavity, abdominal cavity, the pelvic cavity. This is kind of what it looks like. So when you take a look at your thoracic cavity, it's kind of a large, sort of a bell-shaped cavity that looks something like that. Now, that's the thoracic cavity. The abdominal cavity is going to be just underneath it, and it oftentimes merges in with the pelvic cavity. So typically you would have the thoracic cavity here, the abdominal cavity here, and the pelvic cavity is going to be down at the bottom. Separating the thoracic from the abdominal is the diaphragm. The diaphragm is basically the boundary that separates these two. And so in the thoracic cavity, you have the lungs and the heart and the esophagus and the trachea. And in the abdominal cavity, you have all your digestive organs, your kidneys, and things like that. In the pelvic, you have your reproductive organs. And so when you take a look at this, then you can actually further subdivide the thoracic cavity into major pieces, subdivisions, if you will. So if you kind of cut it like this, each one of these is what's called the pleural cavity. This is where each of your lungs resides. And each your right and left lung resides in the pleural cavity. Then you have this middle shaft-like cavity area called the mediastinum. And it has two pieces to the mediastinum. The lower mediastinum is a very special place called the pericardial cavity. This is where your heart resides. So that's where your heart is. And then up here in the upper mediastinum is where your trachea and your esophagus are. Okay. So in your pelvic cavity, and there's no boundary for the pelvic and the abdominal, it's just, you kind of leave one and head to the other. So it's kind of all open to each other. You're going to have other things, like, for instance, your urinary and elimination, just your waste and excretion organs, rectum, urinary bladder, things like that. Also, your reproductive organs are going to be in here. So this is where you find the uterus and the vagina in females. And it's also where you find the vas deferens and the bulbourethral gland and a prostate in males. So associated with that. And so those are the sorts of things you see in that lower region of that lower cavity, the abdominal and the pelvic. Now, external to the abdominal wall in males is the scrotum, basically, which is a sac that holds the testes, which is where the sperm is produced. And so this is the one external structure that we have. The dorsal cavity is actually much, much more limited, because in the dorsal cavity, you basically have your cranial cavity. That's basically the inside of your skull, where your brain lives. And you have the vertebral canal, which is basically where your spinal cord goes through your vertebrae. Okay, so we consider those as cavities. And so this is kind of what it looks like. So here you can see you've got your cranial cavity up here, and you've got your dorsal spinal cord cavity going down your back. And then you've got your thoracic cavity, your abdominal cavity, and then your pelvic cavity, all lined in your ventral. This is where all your visceral organs are. So when you kind of turn this around and you sort of cut it cross section, you can see you've got your pleural cavities here, lined by the pleura, which is the name that we give to the liners that line those canals. Your pericardial cavity, the bottom part of your mediastinum, which is where the heart resides, and your peritoneal cavity, which is the abdominal cavity lined by the peritoneal linings. And then you have your pelvic cavity below with your reproductive organs and your excretory organs. And so that's basically how your cavities are organized. Now, the reason why we mention that is because this is where your organs live. In order to understand where your organs live, you got to basically have a little idea about their neighborhood. And you also have to understand how their neighborhood is organized, at least in terms of membranes, right? Because you don't just have big old holes in your body. You also have to cover those as well with membranes. And so you have a couple of different types of membranes in your body. You have mucous membranes, serous membranes, synovial membranes, and then the meninges that are limited to the nervous system. So let's cover each of these. First of all, the mucous membranes. The mucous membranes are essentially epithelium, so it's epithelial tissue that's usually lay on top of some sort of connective tissue. And what these guys do is they secrete mucus. That's what they do for a living through these goblet cells. And what they'll do is they'll line things like the respiratory tract, the urinary tract, the digestive system, reproductive systems. These are all lined with mucus. Oftentimes, they're in contact with the outside world. And so that's what they're doing. So if you think about where they are, digestive system, contact with the outside world. You just ate something from the outside world. Respiratory system, contact with the outside world. You just breathe in the outside world. Urinary system, you're contacting the outside world because you're basically eliminating material into the outside world. Reproductive system is also in contact with the outside world. So these are all basically protecting us from those major potential entry points, especially with pathogens that could basically get in there. Body membranes, our cavities, this kind of follows up on our cavity discussion. We also have the serous membranes. And what serous membranes do is they basically will line cavities in your ventral cavities. And they'll also cover and surface organs as well. And so when you take a look at it, the serous membranes have a classic lining. They have what's called the visceral layer. Which covers the organ itself. And then they typically have a little bit of a cavity, and then they have what's called the parietal layer, or the parietal membrane, which covers the cavity, or the wall of the cavity. So think of the serous membranes, like especially the parietal layer, as being like a layer of wallpaper on the inside of a wall. Okay, so that's going to be like your parietal. So there's always this kind of the same process. For instance, when you take a look at the coverings of the lungs, it's the pleura. So there's parietal pleura that covers the inside of those pleural cavities. Then there's an intrapleural space, a gap. And then there's visceral pleura, which covers and lays on top of the lungs itself. The pericardium, the same thing, right? You have parietal pericardium, which covers the inside of the pericardial cavity. You have pericardial gap, or a cavity, if you will. And then you have the visceral pericardium, and the same thing with the peritoneum, which is in the abdominal peritoneum. The parietal peritoneum will cover the inside of the abdominal cavity. And then you'll have a bit of a gap of space, a cavity, if you will, the opening area, which in the abdominal cavity is a large open area. There's a lot of stuff in that open area. And then resting on top of the digestive organs will be the visceral peritoneum. And the visceral peritoneum is an extensive membrane that sort of dovetails and branches out into what's called the mesenteries, which are these long or these large membrane complexes that basically wraps up and bundles all the digestive organs. And it covers all those organs. You also have synovial membranes. So this is another one. You're only going to see these in synovial joints, in movable joints. So this is a layer of cells that will secrete synovial fluid for lubrication. So for instance, your fluid in your knee, if anybody's ever had to have fluid taken off of your knee, that's there's fluid in your knee to basically actually lubricate your knee. It's produced by the synovial membrane that encapsulates your knee joint. And so those are specifically located in those movable joints. Meninges basically are essentially the layers of the brain. So these are essentially the membranes or the covering of the brain, of the nervous system. And so if you have an inflammation of these layers, that's what meningitis is. So anything with an itis at the end of it means it's an inflammation of something. In this case, it's an inflammation of the meninges. Okay, so let's do a little bit of a quick round through the integument system, right? This is the first of our systems. This is basically our skin for the most part, and of course the accessory organs. So along with skin, we also toss in their hair and nails and glands and things like that. Some of the functions of our integument system, a couple of them are obvious, right? For instance, it's a protective layer to protect our underlying tissues from trauma, from pathogenic invasion, from water loss. They also help to regulate your body temperature. A lot of people don't realize that. That's a really big, important function of your skin, is to regulate that body temperature. They also have sensory receptors, like for instance, touch and temperature and pressure. Or this is actually really important because if you think about it, your skin isn't just a protective barrier. A lot of us think of our skin as like chainmail, right? To kind of protect us from the enemies out there in the world. And although that is true, I'd say probably a more important function of the skin is to basically act almost like a sensory grid. So basically, all of your interactions, your contacts with your outside world, you're perceiving and getting through your skin. So when you're touching things, when you're grabbing things, how do you know how much pressure you're putting on something? Those are all being communicated to your brain through all of these sensors that are in your skin. So your skin is a multi-dimensional and a multifunctional sort of sensory grid that's designed to take in like massive amounts of data from your environment all at once so that your brain can sort through it all and figure out what's going on in its environment so that you can make an appropriate response to what your environment is giving you. Anybody who's ever had to deal with prolonged numbness knows exactly what I'm talking about. Has anybody ever had numbness or prolonged numbness in a part of their body? People with hand injuries, unfortunately, get to learn about this one firsthand, no pun intended. Right? So basically, when you have numbness in your hands, it's like you can't function because you don't know, you can't feel if something's hot or cold. You can't feel how much pressure you're putting on it, how hard you're grasping onto something. And so it makes it very difficult to do even simple things like tie your shoes, because tying your shoes is actually sending your brain like so much data about how tightly you're holding on to the strings, how tightly you're pulling on it, you know, what end of it you have, how good of a handle of it you have. Do you just have a hold of the edge, or do you have to hold the entire string? And so all that information that we take for granted is all coming through your skin. So it's an incredibly important sensory array system that basically allows us to be able to interpret our environment. That's before you get to the other four senses that you rely on as well. So in skin, you have all of your major tissues, right? So you have basically all of your epithelial tissue, you have your connective tissue, you have your sensory, your nervous tissue, and also your muscular tissue. It's all there. And so when you take a look at your skin, we can break it actually into a couple of major regions. First of all, the outer region was the epidermis. And then on top of the, or underneath the epidermis, kind of like the connective tissue foundation of the epidermis, is the dermis, which is in reality our skin proper. Matter of fact, when you think about your skin, what you're really thinking about is that connective tissue dermis. Matter of fact, the dermis is actually the leather. So if you've ever seen anybody tanning leather, or you've worn something that is leather, the leather is actually the connective tissue of the dermis, of the animal that you're wearing. So if you're wearing leather, cowhide, that's actually the dermis, or the connective tissue of the cow. And then underneath the dermis is going to be what's called the subcutaneous layer, the hypo below dermis, the skin. So then when you take a look at this, then these have consequences, right? So your subcutaneous layer oftentimes is like where you would end up getting your shot, your hypodermic needle, right? Your hypodermic shot, that's basically the hypodermis. But this is also what's protecting you from your kind of the boundary, if you will, from your skin to your underlying structures, which is your muscle. So it's protecting your musculature from that harshness of the outside world. This is kind of what it looks like. So here you can see basically your epidermis is this upper layer, mostly made out of stratified squamous epithelium that's regenerative. At the very bottom, you can see this little pink line right there. That's basically called the stratum basal. That's constantly adding new cells to your skin, so your cell continues to regenerate over time. Below that then is going to be the connective tissue layer, the dermis. This is where all the magic is happening inside the dermis. And then below that is your subcutaneous layer, where you see oftentimes a lot of fat. Your subcutaneous fat is there. That's where you develop and deposit a lot of fat. Within the dermis, you have a lot of things going on. For instance, you can see you've got basically a hair root with your hair growing out of its shaft. You've got a sensory receptor there called the Pacinian or the lamellar receptor. That's a deep touch receptor. You've got what's called Meissner corpuscles, which are basically light touch sensors. You also have capillaries that are up here in this region, so it's very vascular in nature. You have sweat glands that are ducted and are leading up to, here's a sweat duct right here, leading up to the surface of the skin itself. You've got lots of blood vessels in this area. You've got what's called a sebaceous gland. That's this guy right here. That's basically secreting the oils that coat your hair. And then you also have a muscle in there, smooth muscle called the erector pili muscle, which is basically what gives us goosebumps. You can see there's a lot going on in the dermis, and that's the really highly functional area of your skin itself. So let's go ahead and take a look from the outside in. Your epidermis moving in toward your hypodermis. So the epidermis, which is your thinner, relatively speaking, outermost region, is going to be stratified squamous pretty much all the way throughout. It's going to have a lot of stem cells at that very bottom level. And so this is basically going to be the one that's regenerating and adding new cells to replace all the dead cells that are sloughing off of your skin at the top. So as you basically grab onto things that are frictional in nature, you're scraping off skin. Those dead cells, we're shedding cells constantly. As a matter of fact, 80% of household dust is, guess what? Your shed skin cells. So most of what your dust is at home is you. That's pretty gross, right? But that's what it is. It's mostly skin cells. So in order to replace these cells are constantly going through division and basically replacing them with new cells. And so that's why you have those stem cells in that bottom layer. If it happens to be injured, then typically you have to graft on a new piece of skin so that it can take and start replacing it. So an autograft is basically where you take a piece of skin from your own body and put it under an injury site so you can reconstitute that epidermal growth. An allograft is if it's coming from another person, oftentimes from a cadaver. A fresh cadaver, by the way. This doesn't help if they're already decayed, right? But this will allow you to replace your skin and allow your skin to start regenerating. You can also grow skin in the lab. So we're getting pretty clever with these things. So what's in the skin cells? What types of skin cells are there in the epidermis? Well, first of all, we have a very specific type and a very special type of skin cell in the epidermis called keratinocytes. These are basically in the upper layers of the epidermis. And the reason why they call them keratinocytes is because they are filled with a protein called keratin. They're dead. Keratin is like cement. It's like what we would do if we kind of hollowed you out. That sounds kind of gross, but it's getting close to Halloween, right? So it's good to get morbid. If we hollowed you out and we filled you up with cement, that's basically what we do to these cells, right? We fill them up with the cement like keratin. And so they're dead cells, but they're basically just like they retain their shape because they're full of keratin. It's not unlike what happened to the survivors, to the unfortunate non-survivors of Pompeii, right? Where they basically had a body cast because part of what happened was their flesh got mineralized pretty much in seconds. But as they were breathing in that pyroclastic flow, which was essentially mixing with their body fluids and turning into like cement, that basically was filling their body up, and they basically became like a frozen statue of who they were. Their flesh obviously deteriorated, but the shape of it was retained by the pyroclastic flow debris, the ash debris, which set up like cement. Same thing's happening with these cells. And so this forms a really good barrier and a really tough barrier. Now, also out there in the epidermis, not just are the keratinocytes, but you also have other functional cells as well. You have the Langerhans cells, which are a type of white blood cell. This is basically to protect from pathogenic invasion. And you have melanocytes out there as well. This is basically producing melanin, which is our skin color. And the purpose of skin color is not to improve or whatever the way we look. It's not a cosmetic thing. It's purely a protectant, and it protects our skin cells from UV radiation. So whenever we get ourselves exposed to UV radiation, our skin responds by making more melanin. The reason why if you already have a lot of melanin, you just darker, right? So you basically make more melanin, you deposit more melanin. And so generally speaking, when we take a look at the melanocytes that we generally have the same number of melanocytes. So a lot of people think, oh, well, you're just making more melanocytes. No, you're not, really. You have the same melanocytes that you've always had. What you've done is you've just basically stimulated the melanocytes you do have to make more melanin. So you don't make more workers, you make the workers work more. Does that make sense? So it's kind of a little bit of a different strategy there. So there's other contributors to skin color as well. It's not just melanin, and there's more than just one shade of melanin. There's different colors of melanin, actually. There's kind of a brown, black melanin, and there's also kind of a reddish yellow melanin. We also have carotene, which basically is the color that's associated with carrots. And we also have hemoglobin, which is your red blood cells. That's that pigment that makes your blood red, which is, by the way, one of the reasons why you get flushed or you blush. That's basically that redness in the face is your hemoglobin showing through your skin. It's a little easier to see in people with low melanin count in their skin because the melanin color isn't hiding it or covering it up. The other major thing with the epidermis is basically these epidermal cells will make vitamin D. Vitamin D is stimulated by UV radiation. And what happens is it is a regulator, it's a co-absorbent for calcium. So this allows you to be able to absorb calcium in your diet. So if you're drinking all the milk in the world, but you never get out and get any sunshine, you're not going to really be absorbing that calcium that you're drinking. It's just going to be going right through you because you need vitamin D in order to absorb calcium. Yeah, you don't need a lot of it, maybe about 30 minutes a day. You know, that's enough. So it's very potent, but you do need some of it. Now let's get to the good stuff, the dermis, right? This is where the magic is happening. This is where you have that thick connective tissue underneath the epidermis. So it's all fibrous connective tissue, dense, irregular typically is what it is. There's lots of collagen in it, lots of elastin in it. There's a lot of strength and elasticity in your skin, so it's able to distort and regain its shape, recoil. It also has lots of blood vessels in it, sensory receptors, glands in it. So there's a lot of stuff going on here. And this is basically where you have a lot of that magic. A lot of sensory receptors are basically going to be embedded in your dermis itself. So if you think about it, the epidermis is really purely just a covering. Your dermis is where all the function is happening. And then you have your subcutaneous layer, which is typically a fat reserve on the bottom. This is composed of loose connective tissue, typically specifically adipose tissue. So this is fat, right? Fat cells. And so this will be the place where you store your energy in fat deposits. It's where you insulate because fat is insulatory. And it also protects you from external blows, right? This is all true for fat. Right, so we store basically all of our fat reserves, our love handles, our saddlebags, right? The spare tire, everybody, you know, wherever you're depositing that in your subcutaneous fat region. That's where your fat deposits are in your body. And so that's a energy storage, and it's also insulation. So there's a reason why mammals, for instance, in particular, they kind of blubber up a little bit, like especially you see this in sea creatures, where they kind of increase their amount of blubber. So that they can withstand the cold Arctic temperatures and the cold Arctic oceans before they go migrating. Bears fatten up before they hibernate, right? So it's because it's insulatory and it's also a source of energy that they can kind of chew on or work on while they're hibernating at a very low pace. And of course, it protects as well, right? So basically, you've got layers of cushioning fat protecting your organs underneath. And so it does all of those. So those are good things, not bad things. Then you have your accessory organs, right? So basically your accessory organs are going to be your skin, your skin are going to be your hair and your nails and your glands, right? So for instance, your nails, which are designed to cover your fingers, they're supposed to be protective in nature. In some animals, of course, those are for digging, some are for defending. And so your nails will have different functions depending on your animal. But typically what will happen is nails grow from what's called a nail root. And their job is to cover what's called the nail bed itself. And so the nail root is located down by the cuticle, which is that little piece of skin at the base of your fingernail that's covering the nail root. And just above that is what's called the lunula or the moon. And that's basically this little whitish or lighter colored area just above your nail root. So the root, actually, if you look at it, basically grows, the nail grows by the same process that your skin grows. The only difference is, instead of just being cells full of cement, it just strips away all the cells and you just got pure cement. And that's what the nail is. The nail is pure keratin. There's no more cell left whatsoever. It's just been basically converted into long sheets of keratin, and that's basically what your nail is. So what happens is, this layer right here, like if you take a look here at the base, you'll see that little regenerative layer at the bottom of your skin, which is feeding and replacing all those skin cells in the epidermis above it. Well, that basically is the same layer that comes in underneath the root, the nail root, and it's basically adding the same thing. It's adding nails or cells to that base. But what happens is different, is instead of just having a layer of cells that are full of keratin, it puts in so much keratin that basically all the cells just basically get stripped away, and all you have left over is just this sheet of keratin that then basically gets slowly added to. So basically what's happening is you're adding a new layer on each end here. And as you add a new layer on each end at the base, it pushes the nail forward, and then the nail grows in length up here. Okay. And then of course, underneath that, the skin underneath that is going to be the nail bed itself. So that's for all you manicurists out there. We'll put a little AMP into the manicure. So what about hair? So hair basically comes in a couple of things. First of all, we got hair follicles and we got a hair shaft. So the hair follicles are essentially the epidermal structures from here in the epidermis that are surrounding the actual hair itself. The shaft is the piece that's going actually protruding from the skin. So once it leaves the skin to the outside world, we consider it the shaft. And then the actual follicle is underneath the skin. It's all that epidermal dermal structure that's around the skin itself, around the hair follicle itself. Now, there's also melanocytes at the point. It's the same basic idea, by the way. You have cells that are basically reproducing and adding new layers of cells, and they happen to be wrapped in melanocytes in your hair bed, in the matrix of your hair. And so your melanocytes basically will lay down the melanin in your hair matrix, and that'll give your hair its color, which is the reason why your hair tends to be, the hair color tends to be related to your skin color. They kind of tend to go, they're not exact, of course, right? But they tend to be directly proportional. The darker your skin, often the darker your hair, usually, not always, because they're under different genetic regulation. However, as they age, these melanocytes start to produce less pigment, and then eventually they get to the place where they don't produce any pigment at all, and then that causes their hair to turn gray. As a matter of fact, I read a really, really good article where they actually figured out why exactly gray hair occurs. Because melanocytes are regenerated by a group of stem cells that constantly divide and replace old melanocytes that die off as they've reached their shelf life. Remember, every cell in your body has a shelf life. They don't live forever, and so they have to be replaced. So there's a group of stem cells whose job it is to replace these melanocytes. Well, what happens as you get older is these stem cells begin to die, and they're no longer around to regenerate these old melanocytes. So once the melanocytes basically die off, there's no more stem cells to replace them with. And then those hairs, that particular follicle, then has no more melanin to deposit into the hair structure itself, and that one comes out gray. Now, as this process, as these stem cells slowly die off over time, then the number of gray hair follicles increases, and then we see that in the mirror as an increase in gray hair. Okay. And that is under genetic control, right? We know that. Why? Because people have a dramatically variable point at which they gray, don't they? I mean, some people who don't, now, of course, bottles notwithstanding, that's cheating, right? But some people, it doesn't seem like they turn gray like ever. It's like they're like in their 70s and they've got a dark head of hair. And then there's other people who are like 20 and they're already moving toward white hair, right? And so you can see there's a very widely variable genetic type of a background when it comes to a lot of this sort of ebb and flow of how people gray, by the way. And since that's a melanin depositing issue, graying is, it's also quite variable when it comes to skin color and skin color deposition and things like that. Okay. A lot of genetics in there. Then we also have the erector pili muscles. Those are also accessory organs. So these are your smooth muscle attachments to your hair shaft. And when they contract, they basically cause the hair to stand up. And that's what we now know as goosebumps, or like when the hair stands up on end on the back of your neck. Okay. So a couple of others. Remember we said there's also glands in our accessory organs. Two very important ones, by the way. Oil glands. So the oil glands, the sebaceous glands, are actually attached to the hair follicle. And what they do is they secrete sebum, which is an oily secretion. And it's basically our natural conditioner. And it basically coats your hair and your skin, right? That's why our skin gets oily over time, or it's why our hair gets greasy. And this is designed to be a good thing, right? So it's designed basically to ward off bacterial growth. So it actually has antibacterial applications to it, as well as maintenance of our fur coat, if you will. How many of you guys have ever had a dog? Like hound dogs get this way sometimes, but some dogs kind of have a naturally kind of an oily feel to their fur. If you've ever had a hound dog, they are oily little things. Basset hounds are, beagles are, bloodhounds are. They have a natural sort of a secretion in their fur that kind of makes it a little oilier in nature. And other dogs are kind of really dry, like poodles, for instance, have a really dry fur, right? It's kind of dry and brittle. And hound dogs have kind of an oily fur. It's like you pet them and it's like you can feel like that little sort of sheen of oil on them. It's like a natural conditioner for them that keeps their coat nice and sort of supple. It also tends to give hound dogs kind of a little bit of a hound dog smell. If you've ever had a hound dog, they kind of have a bit of a smell to them. Basset hounds are notorious for this. I mean, they stink. I mean, in a hound dog sort of a way, right? So you had to wash them all the time. Beagles also have kind of a little beagle smell to them. Bloodhounds have a kind of a hound dog smell to them. There's kind of this musky hound dog smell to them. And so that's part of their sebum. That's part of their sebaceous glands. This also can cause acne. For instance, if you have a sebaceous gland irritation or an inflammation of the sebaceous gland, this can also cause acne. And so you'll get a lot of issues associated with that. Sweat glands is another one, right? These are called sudoriferous glands, if you want to impress your friends. So sweat glands, basically, these guys are going to be found in the dermis, and their job is to secrete sweat, which is a complex gamish, mostly watery, not oily like sebum, mostly liquidy. But they have ducts that will open up on the surface of the skin, and their main job, is to regulate body temperature. This is how you cool off. This is essentially, you're cooling off by the same mechanism as evaporative cooling. Anybody know what evaporative cooling is? Anybody have a swamp cooler on their house? Anybody ever take like water and you kind of blow it on yourself to cool yourself off? Anybody ever sweat? No, of course not, because we all glow, right? I don't sweat, I glow. Like, no, you're sweating. But anyway, basically what happens is because water has a high specific heat, that is to say it retains a lot of energy before changing temperature, it means when you're hot, basically what happens is your hot blood, which is where a lot of your core body temperature is, right? That's in your hot blood. We're all hot-blooded. That goes to the surface of your skin, and that heat goes into your sweat and is absorbed by the liquid, the water in your sweat. And so when the sweat goes to the surface of your skin, it's still carrying a lot of that heat that you have in your blood. So you're offloading that heat into your sweat. Now, when a cool breeze comes by and it feels cool, what's happening is the sweat is evaporating. It's going off into the atmosphere, but it's taking the heat along with it. And so as it takes the heat along with it, basically you sense that as a cool sensation. And so that's exactly how evaporative cooling works in a house. right? Typically a swamp cooler, you have little water pads that you filter water through. And the idea is you blow air through it and the water sucks the heat out of the air, but the cool air that's left behind, it's blown through your house. So it's kind of like water-based air conditioning. Okay. Now let's go ahead and dig into homeostasis to kind of round out the last bit of this chapter. Where homeostasis basically is our ability to retain constant internal environment. That's basically what homeostasis is. Lots of conditions in your body are under constant stability. We try to maintain constant levels. For instance, blood glucose is constantly regulated to maintain a constant regular level of blood glucose. Your pH is regulated to maintain a constant pH. Your body temperature, which is coming around 37 degrees C, is regulated and maintained homeostatically at a constant temperature. And so generally speaking, if we get out of these homeostatic norms, bad things happen. Okay. So when we take a look at our internal environment, our blood, and especially our interstitial fluid, which is basically the fluid of our tissues. What we have is a balance between the movement of things. And we're going to see this in actually chapter 5, we look at the cardiovascular system, right? So basically you get oxygen delivery and nutrients to tissues, and you get carbon dioxide being taken away and waste being taken away as well. And so generally it's the interstitial fluid that surrounds these body cells that will basically exchange with your blood back and forth. And that keeps a steady homeostasis of oxygen and nutrients for your cell, but also maintains that the trash basically doesn't build up. So what controls homeostasis? Well, the nervous system and the endocrine system are the biggies, right? Because the nervous system controls all things in your body. It's fast. It's typically used when you need a quick response and you don't have a lot of time. The endocrine is a little bit more of a long-term, sort of a long strategy. This is your response system that will help you to be able to regulate things over the long term. Okay. So you can think of the nervous system as cramming for the exam the night before. It's a fast process, right? Whereas you can think of studying for the exam a little bit every day, even though the exam is 2-3 weeks away, as more like an endocrine type of a strategy, right? So it's a more of a long-term type of a strategy. No, I'm not talking about the exam, this exam. We're just talking about exams in general. Yeah. Right. So that's kind of how those two work. The endocrine system typically is a chemical system, and this is where you're going to be secreting your hormones, and your chemical messengers will then go through the bloodstream to regulate the activities of all of your different organs. So when you take a look at homeostasis, for instance, your endocrine system is going to be secreting hormones to regulate a lot of these responses. Your respiratory system is going to be balancing oxygen and carbon dioxide with your tissues. Your urinary system is homeostatically balancing water salt balances. Your lymph system is working along with your cardiovascular system to balance also water as well. Your integument system is helping to regulate the homeostasis of body temperature. Your muscular system is also involved in body temperature because your muscular system is the major producer of body heat. That's where your heat comes from. That's the reason why you shiver. When you get cold, you're trying to increase the heat in your body to bring your core body temperature up. Your digestive system is basically striking homeostasis because it is basically trying to, number one, get rid of indigestible items, plus bring in the nutrients that you need in order to homeostatically balance that with your tissues. Cardiovascular system is transporting the oxygen and nutrients that you need to balance between you and your tissues, and the nervous system is helping to coordinate all that along with the endocrine system. So you can see basically what you see here then is homeostatically, and this is true for most things, is organ systems aren't basically, we don't just have lines drawn around organ systems and they basically work in oscillation. Typically what happens is the organ systems all work together in a continuum, in an integrated form, where oftentimes you don't really know when you've left the cardiovascular system and when you've entered the urinary system, right? So they basically blur into each other, and that's pretty typical for physiology. Okay, now that we have homeostasis, how do we control this and regulate this? Well, we've got two major kind of control or regulatory mechanisms called feedback systems, both negative and positive feedback. So a negative feedback system basically is the primary mechanism that we're going to be using in the body. And this is essentially rigged the same way, where you have to have certain components. Number one, you have to be able to sense what your normal condition is. You have to be able to detect your condition, the external condition. You have to have a control center, which in this case is our brain, right? You have to have somebody to process this incoming information. And then you have to have some sort of an output. You have to have some sort of a response to that basically acts on that intelligence. It's very much the same way that a furnace works in order to regulate your temperature. So here's how it looks. So here's your homeostasis. Let's say you disturb it, go too much. So there's some sort of a stimulus. That's your stimulus, right? So there's too much of whatever it is happens to be. There's a sensor that has to interpret that. It's like, okay, I sense and I can actually see that there's too much of this. It sends that data to the control center, which then integrates that information, makes some sort of a decision, and sends that to the effector, who will then do some sort of a job to basically balance that out and then basically restore homeostasis. It's very similar to the way your thermostat works. So for instance, if your homeostasis, your temperature in your house becomes too much, becomes too hot, you have some sort of a sensor in your house that picks up that temperature, yes? So that sensor will say, okay, 70 degrees, it's too hot, right? And then what's going to happen is going to send that data to the thermostat, the control center, who will then process that information. And basically the information there in the control center is our set point is 68. If greater than 68, then do this, right? So it's kind of like an if-then program inside the thermostat. If less than 68, do this. So in this case, it's more than 68. So its response is to turn the furnace off. If greater than 68, turn the furnace off. It's already hot enough. When the furnace turns off, then that temperature should start to come back down and it should even that homeostatically out. But what happens if it becomes too little? It gets cold. So the stimulus will be picked up by the thermostat, right? So it basically gets sensed at 66, so it's too cold now, right? Now that's going to go to the control center. The thermostat now says, okay, if less than 68, do this, right? It is less than 68. So the output is going to be turn the furnace on. That's going to blow hot air into the house, which is going to bring it back to homeostatic norm. And then around and round and round we go. And that's exactly how these feedback loops work. Here's an example of body heat, which works exactly like a thermostat in our body. So basically, if we have our body heat, our core body temperature going too high, we sense that body heat. It goes to the sensors that are part of the central nervous system. That sensor goes to the appropriate part of the brain, which says, okay, we are set at, in this case, 98.6 or 37 degrees C. If above, then do this, right? And so it is above, so it's too hot. And then what's going to happen is it's going to start making physiological changes, the effectors, to get rid of excess heat. For instance, it's going to dilate those blood vessels to get excess heat to your skin. It's going to also cause your sweat glands to secrete more. Why? Because you are loading that excess heat into your sweat so you can sweat it off, your evaporative cooling scenario. This should cool you down and get your core body temperature back down to normal. However, if it goes below homeostasis, there's also receptors in your skin and throughout your body that will sense that drop in temperature. Your core body temperature gets too cold. That's going to go to your correct brain center to basically say, listen, you know what? We're below 98.6 degrees now. So now we need to do this. In this case, you're going to constrict your blood vessels because you want to retain your heat, keep your core body temperature good and hot. You inactivate your sweat glands because you don't want to lose excess heat. And also, if you get really cold, you're going to start contracting your muscles involuntarily, shivering, so that you can generate more heat and increase that core body temperature, which should bring you back to homeostasis. So you can see basically how you have a similar type of a situation where you have these feedback loops where your body is connected, but it's the same trajectory: sensation, integration, and then a response. Okay. So positive feedback generally will make a change in the same direction. So here's a good example. It would say basically reinforces something. So a good example of a positive feedback is during childbirth. For instance, when the fetus's head pushes against the cervix, this is a physical mechanical stimulation that's sent to the brain, right? So that's a sensation. Notice that's your sensory. It's sent to the brain, which is your control center. And then the brain, in response, will secrete the hormone oxytocin, which causes stronger contractions of the uterine lining or the musculature of the uterus, causing essentially the labor contractions. And so the more that physical pressure that the baby's head puts on there, the more reinforcement that oxytocin gets. And so the more oxytocin you actually get that's released, the more it reinforces itself. So the oxytocin actually goes in and reinforces its own secretion. This is one of the reasons why birth contractions become stronger and stronger and stronger, because what you're seeing is kind of like an exponential increase in the birth contractions. They start off slight at first, and then they get stronger and closer together and stronger and closer together. That's because of that positive reinforcement. So the more you contract, the more that sends a signal back to the brain to secrete more oxytocin, which causes the uterine lining to contract more, which then sends a positive reinforcement signal back to the brain, which basically makes more oxytocin. And so you can kind of see the self-reinforcing loop that basically ends ultimately once the child is born. That stops the feedback loop because it breaks the physical stress point on the uterine lining. So you no longer feel that big old baby head causing that physical mechanical pressure that created it all in the first place. Okay, so without that pressure, then you start to deconstruct everything. So that is pretty much the end of chapter 4. So let's see if I can't fire up and see if I was smart enough to do this. I probably wasn't. The next chapter, which is chapter 5, cardiovascular system. Okay. Here we have it, chapter 5. So cardiovascular system. So we're going to start off with the heart and blood vessels, and then chapter 6 will be blood. And so this is a really important system because there is a lot, this is our core visceral system. So there's a lot going on here. So the cardiovascular system is basically made up of heart and blood vessels. And we're going to be taking a look at each of those. So the heart obviously is a pump that pumps the blood through the blood vessels. And its job is to bring nutrients and oxygen to cell and also to pick up waste and get rid of the waste. So it's an exchange. So the blood basically goes through the blood vessels and exchanges these substances, oxygen and nutrients, for the waste, and that's happening between the blood and those interstitial tissues themselves. So when you take a look at the circulatory system, the cardiovascular system is probably the most central system in the entire body. Matter of fact, if you remember nothing about any other system, the cardiovascular system is the one that you want to remember, because it is like the kingpin, the bullseye, the central point of all the other systems. Everything dovetails and kind of connects to the cardiovascular system. Or rather speaking, all roads lead to Rome, all roads lead to the cardiovascular system, or rather all roads from the cardiovascular system leads to everywhere else in the body. So you have blood vessels that composes miles and miles of vessels and infiltrates pretty much every nook and cranny of your body. Every little dark corner of your body has to have access to blood vessels. This is basically your supply line, right? So if you ever study military tactics, one of the things that you'll notice is one of the relatively unglorious ways of winning a war is to win a war tactically, right? So for instance, if you can threaten an enemy military's supply lines, then you can literally starve the army into submission. And that's happened many, many, many times throughout history, is armies that have basically lost their supply lines are no longer able to fight. Why? Because soldiers need to eat too, right? A good soldier is a well-fed soldier, is a strong soldier, and you're only going to win the battle, especially back in the day when battle was definitely an active physical, a very physical fight. You had to be strong in your body and well-fed because it was a physical fight. And so you're not going to outlive your supply lines. It's just not going to happen. So wherever your supply lines go, that's the limitation of where your cells can go, right? So basically that means that you have to have blood vessels that carry nutrients and oxygen to every little nook and cranny of your body. And in addition to that, since they're carrying oxygen, they also have to work with the respiratory system to basically exchange gases. For instance, they're constantly exchanging carbon dioxide for oxygen. So they go to the lungs to pick up oxygen and they dump off carbon dioxide to be getting rid of at the lungs. And then what they do is they go to the cells themselves to drop the oxygen off and to pick up CO2 as trash. So they'll work with the digestive system in order to basically pick up nutrients so they can deliver that to the cells that need those nutrients. They work with the liver because they're taking those nutrients to the liver so that the liver can detoxify what you've just eaten and metabolize what you've just eaten before you release it to the rest of the body. It works with the kidneys in order to purify the blood and also to retain water and maintain blood pressure. So you can see it works with a lot of different other systems. It's not just its own thing. So the functions of the cardiovascular system are number one for transport. That's a big one, right? So what is it transporting? Well, it's transporting oxygen, right? That's a big one. It's transporting carbon dioxide, so it's getting rid of that as waste. Other waste products that aren't carbon dioxide, it's getting rid of nitrogenous compounds and metabolic byproducts and things like that. It's also getting rid of. Nutrients, it's transporting nutrients that are associated with what you just ate so that it can get that out to the rest of the cells. Hormones, we just talked about glands and epithelial tissue spreading hormones around the body. Those are going to be spread around and moved around the body through your blood cells or through your blood vessels, your cardiovascular system. And also it's a transporter of your immune cells. Your white blood cells are constantly in motion in your red blood cells. As a matter of fact, that's a component of your blood is white blood cells. Antibodies you'll also find in your blood, which is basically being transported throughout your cardiovascular system as well. So you can see it's basically delivering a lot of different stuff. Very, very needful things for your body. You got to be able to have these things in order to be able to function. So what is it doing for homeostasis? Well, number one is it's a main player in controlling these internal conditions. For instance, it is the source of your body temperature. I just mentioned before, just a few minutes ago, that your blood is hot. And that is the main driver of your core body temperature, your hot blood, carrying the heat that's generated by your skeletal muscles. So your skeletal muscles are what's creating the heat. Your blood, your hot blood, is what's carrying the heat throughout your body. pH, it also is your pH balance. So your blood pH is basically designed to regulate all the rest of the pHs in all of your body fluids. It's the main balancer of water. It carries the water in your system. Your blood is actually mostly made out of water. And of course, there are dissolved electrolyte levels. So these are basically ions in your blood that are necessary for your physiology. So you can see then that basically what's in your cardiovascular system is super critical for normal function of your cardiovascular system. So let's take a look at this in terms of the basic conduit. I'm going to go purple. I think I'm going to go purple here. So from your heart, you're basically going to move your blood from your heart. Your heart's going to pump it out through your system, and it's going to go to your lungs, first of all, where it's going to exchange oxygen and CO2. And then from your lungs, it's going to go out to your interstitial tissues, where it's going to exchange oxygen for CO2 with your tissue cells who need oxygen, and they're getting rid of CO2. And then it's going to exchange different materials and ions with your kidneys. As it gets purified, it goes through the kidneys. And then it goes on the way up through the liver. So it picks up nutrients as it goes through your digestive system, and then is screened by the liver. And then only then does it go back to the heart for redistribution to the rest of the body. So you can see basically there's a couple of things here. You can see the circuit, the basic circuit of blood throughout the body, right? It's got a couple of stopping points that it has to make in order to be able to do what it needs to do. It's stop at the lungs, has to stop at your tissues to make some deliveries, has to stop at the kidneys to make a few deliveries, it has to stop at your liver to make a few deliveries. The other one is also that when you take a look at the blood vessels, your circulatory system is a closed system. Notice if your system is complete, not damaged, not injured, what you basically have is a situation where the blood should never leave your blood vessels. It's a closed system. It's a closed and pressurized system. And that's important because we're going to take a look at the lymphatic system in the next chapter, or in a couple of chapters, which is actually a dramatically different type of a system. So your lymphatic system, which kind of is goes along with the cardiovascular system, is essentially a shadow system. This one is an open system. And it's basically working with our immune system. Basically, it's going to be responsible for collecting a lot of that excess tissue fluid and returning it back to the bloodstream. So it's like a sponge to mop up that interstitial fluid that gets left behind. That keeps your cells from and your tissues from swelling significantly. Basically, swelling is taking on a lot of fluid in your tissues. And so that fluid enters your lymph vessels as lymph, and then it goes back ultimately to the blood. So it's open because it basically takes in all this extra tissue. We'll talk more about that in the next couple of chapters. Okay, let's take a look at the blood vessels. There are three types of blood vessels that we have that are transporting stuff. You have arteries, which are the largest, veins, which are not quite as large as arteries, depending on what you're looking at, and capillaries, which are important because these are the physiologically important vessels. This is where all your exchange happens. This is what it looks like. So when you take a look at this, you'll see a couple things. First of all, so this is basically your artery up here in the red. And so your artery is carrying your blood. Typically speaking, this is an white light micrograph of an artery. So you can see the artery has this really thick wall, muscular wall. And that's true of arteries. They tend to have this really thick muscular wall. And they tend to have a relatively small lumen, that is to say, the internal portion. Veins, on the other hand, have typically a very thin outer wall, but a very large lumen. And so you can see they're similarly constructed, but the layers that they're constructed of differ in terms of how they're composed based on the kinds of pressures that they're having to deal with inside themselves. Generally speaking, what you have is you have blood coming from your heart through your artery, and it gets into smaller and smaller and smaller arteries until it enters into the capillary bed. And here you can see a capillary bed, which basically will have oxygenated, nutrient-rich blood going through the capillary. and it'll go through these little individual capillary vessels that are very tiny and very thin, and it'll exchange. So this is the point of exchange. So when you're exchanging oxygen for CO2, it's happening in the capillary. When you're exchanging nutrients for waste, it's happening in the capillary. When you're exchanging fluid, water, it's happening in the capillary. So this is the most important place of the entire, this is where your entire cardiovascular system is kind of geared toward. It's geared toward looking at this. Now you notice all these little muscles here that are kind of wrapped around the entrance points of these capillaries. These are what's called sphincter, precapillary sphincter muscles. And what they do is they can cinch down on that capillary and cut it off, disallowing blood from going into that capillary too. This is helpful because these capillary sphincters can basically allow you to direct and redirect blood through the capillary bed so that you can direct that blood to the point of greatest need. So if this area of tissue is good, well fed and well nourished, don't need any blood right now, then what you can do is you can close these guys off, and then you can move all your blood over here to the other side where there's greater need. Okay, so it's not feeding the well satisfied, it's feeding the hungry. So if you're already satisfied and you're full, then we'll take the food and move it towards somebody who's hungry. Right? That's kind of what it's like. So when you start off with your arteries, the important thing with an artery, and this oftentimes will confuse students because we get into the whole red and blue convention. That's pretty typical. But that usually gets confused, especially when you're talking about the central cardiovascular system, because it gets backwards. If you always remember this, arteries away, and you'll never go astray. So arteries are always carrying blood away from the heart, regardless of whether they've got oxygen in them or not. They're always moving away from the heart. They tend to have three main layers to their walls that we see. The innermost layer is thin. It's endothelium. It's typically a single layer of simple squamous tissue on a basement membrane with a little bit of areolar connective tissue underneath. That's usually what that is. So it's a very thin layer. The middle layer is smooth muscle and elastic tissue. There's elastic membranes in there. This allows for musculature and contraction, dilation of the blood vessels, but it also allows it some flexibility to expand and contract. And then you have the outer layer, which is the tough connective tissue outer layer, which protects the artery itself. Then we have the arterioles. These are smaller. These are what's called the resistance vessels. Why? Because they do most of the regulation of blood pressure. So it's mostly a very thin amount of smooth muscle, not a lot of extra connective tissue on the outside. But these guys are the ones that are constricting blood vessels. That basically narrows the blood vessel. That reduces blood flow, but increases blood pressure. And then they can also dilate, what's called vasodilation, that increases the blood flow, but reduces the pressure. So they can basically manipulate and regulate blood pressure with these arterioles. And that's the reason why we call them the resistance vessels. Because when your body is regulating blood pressure, it's the arterioles typically that they're using and dilating and contracting in order to control your blood pressure itself. So the capillaries, notice how we're going in order. We went from arteries to arterioles to capillaries, then we'll go from venules to veins to large veins. So we're kind of moving our way through the pathway of blood through the circulatory system. That's basically what we're doing. And so now we've landed on the most physiologically important area of the entire circulatory system in the blood vessels, the capillaries. And so what I want to do is, rather than rush through this, I want to stop with this one and I want to start with this one so that we can have a really good conversation about the capillaries. Okay.